If you've lived somewhere your entire life, but your name is not on the deed, is it still your home? That question sounds simple. It isn't. And in 2026, it may be the most dangerous unanswered question in the entire Whittaker story. For years, people argued about videos, about money, about outsiders, about motives. But almost no one stopped long enough to ask the one thing that decides everything once the cameras leave. Who actually controls the house on paper? Because homes don't just exist emotionally. They exist legally. And when those two realities drift apart, families lose protection without realizing it's happening. By January 2026, the Whittaker situation enters a phase that doesn't look dramatic on screen but is devastating in real life. According to record-based summaries tied to late 2025 actions, 3 members of the household were removed by Adult Protective Services. Only 2 people remain living on the property: Betty, age 73, and Larry, age 69. That shift alone changes everything. A house that once held 5 adults, each reinforcing the other's presence, is now occupied by 2 aging people whose legal power over the land may not match their lifetime of living there. And when occupancy shrinks, vulnerability expands. This is where the story stops being about sympathy and starts being about structure. Because in rural America, and especially in Appalachia, land ownership is often informal in practice and fragile in law. Families live on property for generations without updated deeds, without probate filings, without clear title transfers. The house becomes the family home by habit, not by paperwork. And habit does not hold up in court. The 2026 documentation surrounding the Whittaker case introduces a quiet but critical reality. The state refuses to disclose where the removed family members are or their condition, citing confidentiality laws. That silence is not random. It is administrative. It often signals long-term involvement, potentially guardianship, institutional care, or permanent placement. Those arrangements cost money. And when care costs money, the state looks for assets. For the Whittakers, there is only one meaningful asset: the land. This is not speculation. This is how systems function when vulnerable adults are involved. Care is not free, and when there is property tied to a family, that property becomes part of the long-term calculation whether anyone wants to talk about it or not. That's why the house itself becomes the center of risk in 2026. Not because someone is rushing in to take it tomorrow, but because the conditions that protect it are weakening. Fewer occupants. Aging residents. No clear public explanation of ownership. An ongoing fraud investigation connected to donations meant to improve living conditions. And silence where clarity should be. People assume that if someone lives in a house, they control it. That assumption is wrong more often than anyone wants to admit. In many rural cases, land is held in the name of a long-deceased relative. Sometimes it passes informally. Sometimes it fragments among heirs. Sometimes it ends up in the hands of an LLC or outside entity years earlier, and no one inside the house truly understands what that means. And here is the uncomfortable reality the 2026 research forces us to confront. There are indications that the Whittakers may not hold legal title to the property they have occupied for decades. Records referenced in the research suggest the land may be owned by a third-party entity rather than by the remaining family members themselves. At minimum, the title appears clouded, unclear, unresolved. That does not mean anyone did something wrong. It means the system does not care how long you lived there if the paper says otherwise. And once the system is involved through Adult Protective Services, everything becomes more procedural and less forgiving. Silence replaces explanation. Files replace faces. And decisions are made by people who have never sat on that porch. This is why 2026 is not just another update year. It is a pressure year. Because when only 2 elderly residents remain in a deteriorating home, and when 3 others have been removed under state authority, the house stops being just a place to live. It becomes a legal object under observation. And observation is the first step toward action. The danger here is not that the family suddenly loses the home tomorrow. The danger is that nobody realizes how little control they may already have. If the title is not clear, the family cannot sell the house even if they wanted to leave. They cannot easily repair it with formal contractors. They cannot legally leverage it to secure safer housing. They cannot protect it from legal maneuvers they don't even know exist. And if costs associated with care accumulate, or if the property is deemed unsafe, or if an heir or third party asserts a legal interest, the home can move without the family initiating anything at all. This is how displacement actually happens. Not with bulldozers. With paperwork. That's why the most important Whittaker question in 2026 isn't about the internet. It's about a county clerk's office. It's about deeds. It's about probate. It's about whether living somewhere your whole life gives you any legal power when the system shows up. And the answer to that question determines whether this house is protected or exposed. Before we can talk about whether the home can be sold, repaired, or preserved, we have to understand what the house is in the eyes of the state. Not emotionally, legally, because a house without clear ownership is not a home. It's a risk waiting for the right moment. And that moment is what 2026 may be quietly setting up. In the next part, we stop guessing and walk through the actual paper body of the property. The parcel data, the tax classification, the assessment, the clues that tell you who the system believes this land belongs to and why that belief matters more than anything said online. Before you comment, sit with the question you were asked at the beginning. If you lived somewhere your entire life, but your name was never on the deed, would you still feel safe? Answer yes or no, and tell me why. A house is not just wood and nails. In the eyes of the state, it has a body made of paper. And that paper body decides who has power when everything else falls apart. To understand what 2026 really looks like for the Whittaker home, we have to step away from emotion and look at what the records say, because this is where most people misunderstand what danger actually looks like. It doesn't show up with sirens. It shows up as numbers, classifications, and names that don't match the people sitting inside the house. According to record-based summaries tied to the property area, the Whittaker home sits along Tommy Creek Road in Odd, West Virginia, zip code 25902. It is a small rural parcel, roughly 0.79 acres. The land use classification is residential, mobile home, type designation. The assessed value is extremely low. The annual property tax obligation is almost symbolic. Just a few dollars per year. Those details matter more than people realize. Low assessment, rural zoning, minimal taxes. This is exactly the kind of property that slips through formal systems for decades without anyone forcing clarity. Families live there. Time passes. Owners die. Paperwork never catches up. And that's where danger hides. Because land doesn't belong to the people who live on it. It belongs to whoever the deed says owns it. And here is the critical point the 2026 research raises without speculation or drama. There is no clear indication that the surviving Whittaker siblings are listed as deed holders. Local records and secondary documentation suggest that the land may be held by a third-party entity or trapped in unresolved heirship rather than clean, individual ownership by the family. That doesn't mean the Whittakers don't deserve to be there. It means the system doesn't care about deserving. In Appalachia, heirs property is one of the most common paths to displacement, and it almost always begins the same way. Someone dies without a will. The land passes automatically to all heirs, even distant ones, as tenants in common. No single person owns it outright. Everyone owns a fraction. And no one can act alone. Over generations, that fraction can be divided dozens of times. At that point, the people living on the land may legally own a slice or nothing at all, while still believing the home is theirs because it always has been. Now add 2026 pressure to that reality. 3 residents have been removed under state authority. 2 remain. Both are elderly. The house has documented habitability concerns. Adult Protective Services is involved. Confidentiality laws prevent public explanation. And the fraud investigation tied to donations has introduced another layer of legal sensitivity around assets. This is not a stable legal environment. If the title is clouded, the Whittakers cannot sell the property even if they want to leave. They cannot easily transfer ownership. They cannot leverage it to secure safer housing. And they cannot block certain legal actions if someone else has a recorded interest. That's why people asking, "Why don't they just move?" are missing the point. You cannot move if you cannot sell. You cannot sell what you do not legally control. And you cannot control what the paper does not recognize. The research also notes something that quietly explains several failed plans people argued about online. Efforts to place a modular or manufactured home on the land reportedly stalled. Not because of money alone, but because companies are required to verify clear title before installing permanent structures. Legal departments don't accept verbal ownership. They accept deeds. If the deed is unclear, the answer is no. This is how a family becomes trapped inside a property they don't legally command. Now here's where 2026 becomes especially dangerous. When only 2 elderly occupants remain in a deteriorating structure, the home becomes vulnerable to classification decisions. If inspectors determine it is unsafe, condemnation becomes a possibility. Condemnation does not require ownership by the occupants. It only requires the structure to fail safety thresholds. Once condemned, the house cannot legally be lived in. And if the occupants cannot legally live there, the system begins asking where they will go and who pays for that transition. This is how land quietly changes hands. Not because someone takes it, but because the people living there lose the legal ability to stay. There is another path the research outlines carefully, and it is one most people don't want to think about. Partition. In heirs property situations, any legal heir can file a partition action. That forces a court to either divide the land or order a sale and distribute proceeds among heirs. Partition does not require the consent of the occupants. It only requires legal standing. If the Whittaker land is held in heirship, that risk exists whether anyone talks about it or not. And here is the part that makes 2026 different from every year before it. State involvement changes timelines. When Adult Protective Services is involved and long-term care costs are incurred, the state may seek recovery through assets where permitted by law. That doesn't mean automatic seizure. It means the property enters a zone of legal attention it never had before. This is why the silence matters. The refusal to disclose the location or condition of the removed family members isn't cruelty. It's procedure. And procedure means files are open, evaluations are ongoing, and long-term decisions are being weighed. In that environment, uncertainty about ownership is not neutral. It is dangerous. Because when the system does not know who controls a property, it will eventually find out. And when it does, that discovery often comes with consequences. So no, the house is not safe simply because it has always been there. And no, living somewhere your whole life does not protect you if your name is not on the deed. The house has a paper body. And that paper body is what determines whether the Whittakers have agency or exposure in 2026. This is not about blame. This is about understanding how families lose homes without ever being evicted. Before we talk about who could sell the house, we have to answer a harder truth. In the current legal structure, the Whittaker family likely cannot sell it at all. And when a home cannot be sold, repaired, or leveraged, it stops being a refuge and starts being a liability. In the next part, we will answer the question everyone keeps asking the wrong way: can anyone sell this house? And if not, who actually can move it when the occupants can't? Before you move on, answer this honestly. If a home cannot be sold, cannot be repaired, and cannot be legally controlled by the people living in it, is it protection or a trap? Comment your answer and why. The question everyone keeps asking sounds simple, but the answer is anything but. Can anyone sell this house? In 2026, the most honest answer is this: the people living inside it almost certainly cannot. And that changes everything. When people imagine a home being sold, they picture a decision, a choice. Someone signs papers, hands over keys, and moves on. That image doesn't apply here. What's happening with the Whittaker property sits inside a different legal universe, one where agency erodes quietly and decisions happen around you, not with you. Let's walk through why. To sell a property, a seller must have clear, marketable title. That means one person or a clearly defined group has the legal authority to transfer ownership. If a title is clouded by heirship, third-party ownership, unresolved probate, or missing documentation, a sale cannot legally proceed. Buyers won't touch it. Banks won't finance it. Title companies won't insure it. And none of that changes because someone has lived there for decades. The 2026 research summary is blunt on this point. It states that the Whittaker home is effectively unsellable by the family under current conditions. Not temporarily difficult. Not emotionally complicated. Legally blocked. Here's why. First, heirs property. If the land passed down without a will, every legal heir inherited an undivided interest. That could include siblings, nieces, nephews, cousins, or even descendants of people who left the area generations ago. Some may not even know they technically own a fraction. But legally they do. That means no single person can sell the property outright. Even if Betty or Larry wanted to sell, they would need consent or legal resolution involving all heirs. Identifying them alone can take years. Some may be deceased. Some may live out of state. Some may not cooperate. And until that process is completed through probate or a quiet title action, the house remains frozen. Second, probate. If the last recorded owner on the deed died without probate being finalized, the title never transferred. That means the property still legally belongs to someone who is no longer alive. Until probate is opened and completed, no sale can occur. Probate is not automatic. It costs money. It requires filings, notices, and court approval. And it requires someone with legal standing to initiate it. In 2026, with a family fractured, elderly, and under state scrutiny, that is not a simple step. Third, habitability and condemnation risk. The research describes the home as being in severe disrepair. If inspectors determine it fails safety standards, it can be condemned. Once condemned, the structure cannot be sold as a residence. It can only be sold as land, if at all, and even that depends on zoning and title clarity. Condemnation doesn't remove ownership, but it strips usability. And that makes the property even less valuable to the people living there and more attractive to outside interests who know how to navigate distressed assets. Fourth, third-party title concerns. The research does not claim definitive ownership by an outside entity, but it does flag the presence of third-party names and LLCs in nearby or related records. That raises the possibility that the land may already be owned, partially or fully, by someone other than the Whittaker siblings. If that is true, then the family's relationship to the home is occupancy, not ownership. And occupancy alone does not confer selling rights. This is where people get uncomfortable, because it forces a realization. You can live somewhere your entire life and still have no legal power over its future. Now here's the twist that makes 2026 so volatile. Even if the Whittakers cannot sell the house, someone else potentially can. This is not an accusation. It's a structural reality. If the property is heir's property, any heir with standing can initiate a partition action. Partition allows a court to force the sale of jointly owned property, even if the occupants object. Courts are required to consider factors like family history and hardship, but sale is still a legal option. If the property is owned by a third party or entity, that owner can act according to their rights, subject to tenant protections that may or may not apply. If unpaid taxes or liens exist, those can eventually lead to foreclosure or forced sale, even when the annual tax amount is small. And if long-term care costs are incurred by the state, asset recovery mechanisms can come into play, depending on how ownership is legally defined. This is why the danger in 2026 is not loud. It is procedural. Nobody has to show up with a truck. Nobody has to threaten anyone. The house can change hands on paper while the people inside are still sitting at the kitchen table. That is how families lose homes without understanding when it happened. And it's why the question, can anyone sell it, misses the real issue. The real issue is control. Who has it? Who doesn't? And who is positioned to gain it when the occupants are least able to defend themselves? The research points out something critical here. Because of the fraud investigation tied to donations intended for the family, any assets connected to those funds may be subject to scrutiny, freezing, or delay. Even well-meaning repairs or transfers can stall when law enforcement is involved. That means solutions that rely on speed, urgency, or informal agreements are not just risky. They are impossible. Everything now moves through courts, agencies, and records. And the Whittakers are not driving that process. They are inside it. This is where the emotional weight lands. The house that defined the family's identity has become a legal object beyond their command. It cannot easily be sold to save them. It cannot easily be repaired to stabilize them. And it cannot easily be protected without legal clarity they do not currently appear to have. This is not punishment. It is exposure. Exposure created by decades of informal survival colliding with formal systems that only recognize paperwork. So when people ask, why doesn't someone just help them move? The answer is now clear. Because moving requires control. And control requires a deed. Before you go to the next part, sit with this. If the Whittakers cannot sell the home, but others might eventually be able to force a sale, who is this property really serving right now? Comment your answer. If the house cannot be sold by the people living inside it, the next question becomes far more unsettling. How can it be taken without anyone ever knocking on the door? This is where the story shifts from emotional to procedural, and where most people lose the thread because nothing about it feels dramatic. There are no sirens. No eviction notices taped to windows. No viral confrontation. Just paper moving quietly while life inside the house stays the same, until suddenly it isn't. There are several ways this happens, and none of them require bad intentions to begin. They only require imbalance. The first is partition. Partition is one of the most misunderstood legal tools in rural property disputes. If a property is heir's property, meaning multiple heirs own fractional shares, any one of those heirs can ask a court to divide or sell the land. The court may attempt a physical division first, but with a single residence on a small parcel, that's often impossible. When division can't be done fairly, the court orders a sale. That sale does not require consent from the people living there. Courts are instructed to consider hardship, history, and cultural significance, but those considerations do not override ownership rights. If someone owns a legal share, they can force the issue. And the people most at risk are the ones with the least access to legal counsel. Partition is not theft. It's legal. That's what makes it dangerous. The second pathway is tax leverage. The annual property tax listed in the research is shockingly low, around $4. That leads people to assume taxes aren't a concern. But what matters is not the current bill. What matters is whether there are back taxes, penalties, or administrative errors from earlier years or previous owners. In rural counties, small unpaid balances can sit unnoticed for years. Then they suddenly matter. A tax lien doesn't immediately take a house, but it creates leverage. It can block repairs, block sales, and in worst cases, lead to a tax sale. And once a tax sale occurs, the clock starts ticking fast. This is not speculation. This is how rural land changes hands across Appalachia every year. The third pathway is condemnation pressure. Condemnation does not remove ownership, but it changes the clock. Once a structure is deemed unsafe for habitation, the occupants can be forced to leave even if they legally own it. At that point, the property becomes a liability rather than a refuge. Empty houses deteriorate faster. Empty houses attract attention. And empty houses are easier to move on paper because no one is physically resisting the process. The fourth pathway is state cost recovery. This is the quietest and most misunderstood risk of all. When the state provides long-term care, especially institutional or medical care, it may seek reimbursement from assets belonging to the individual receiving care. This doesn't always happen. It depends on the program, the structure of ownership, and exemptions that vary by situation. But the research is careful here for a reason. It raises the possibility without making an accusation. If assets exist and costs are high, recovery becomes part of the conversation. And the only meaningful asset associated with this family is the land. Again, this doesn't require wrongdoing. It requires vulnerability intersecting with bureaucracy. The fifth and final risk is opportunism dressed as rescue. When a property is known to be distressed, unclear in ownership, and occupied by elderly residents under scrutiny, it becomes visible to people who know exactly how to exploit ambiguity. They don't arrive with force. They arrive with offers. Offers to help with paperwork. Offers to handle things. Offers to protect the house. Those offers often come with documents that are never fully explained. A signature here. A trust there. A power of attorney just in case. And suddenly control shifts without anyone realizing when it happened. This is why the most dangerous moment for the Whittaker home isn't when it collapses physically. It's when someone convinces the occupants they're being helped while quietly positioning themselves between the family and the property. In 2026, this risk is higher, not lower. Because attention has taught people the house exists. Because silence has created confusion. And because weakened agency makes trust easier to manipulate. Now let's address the uncomfortable reality head-on. Even people with good intentions can cause harm here. Someone might believe they're helping by organizing repairs, fundraising, or legal action without understanding the underlying ownership structure. But if money moves before title is clear, it can trigger freezes. If contracts are signed by people without authority, they can be invalid, or worse, used against them later. This is why the research keeps returning to one phrase. Control must precede action. Without verified control, every solution is unstable. So where does that leave Betty and Larry right now? It leaves them in a house that is emotionally theirs but legally ambiguous. It leaves them with limited ability to act proactively. And it leaves them surrounded by systems that will move forward whether they are ready or not. This is not an argument for removing them. It's an argument for slowing everything down. For forcing transparency before movement. For insisting that no transfer, no sale, no trust, no agreement, and no fundraising tied to the property occur without court oversight. Because once a step is taken on paper, it is very difficult to undo. And that brings us to the only question that actually matters now. Who is watching the paperwork? Not the videos. Not the comments. Not the speculation. The documents. In the final part, we'll lay out the single verification step that cuts through every argument, every rumor, and every assumption, and why without it, this house remains exposed no matter how many people say they care. Before moving on, answer this honestly in the comments. If a property's ownership is unclear, should anyone be allowed to make decisions about it without court supervision? Everything in this story now collapses into one unavoidable truth. Nothing else matters until the paper is verified. Not intentions. Not history. Not sympathy. Not even residency. Because in 2026, the Whittaker home is no longer protected by familiarity or time. It is protected, or exposed, by documentation. And here is the most important thing most people still don't understand. Living somewhere for decades does not automatically give you control over it. It gives you presence. It gives you memory. It gives you attachment. But control lives on paper. So when people ask, can the Whittakers sell the house if they want to? Or, why don't they just leave? Or, why hasn't someone stepped in and fixed it? Those questions skip the step that decides everything. Who legally has the right to decide anything at all? The research makes one thing clear without dramatizing it. As of January 2026, the Whittaker family does not appear to have clear, singular ownership authority over the property. That alone explains nearly every stalled solution people argue about online. Why a new house couldn't be placed there. Why repairs never moved forward cleanly. Why outside help became chaotic. Why money became dangerous instead of helpful. You cannot build stability on unclear title. And here's where the conversation has to change tone. Because this is not about blame. This is about preventing the final loss. There is only one step that matters now. What? Everything else is noise until this happens. A full, court-recognized title verification. That means a certified deed from the county clerk. The complete chain of title going back to the last uncontested owner. Any probate filings connected to that owner. Any liens, judgments, or pending actions. Confirmation of whether the land is held by heirs, an LLC, or another entity. Not summaries. Not screenshots. Not second-hand explanations. Certified records. Without that, every conversation about saving the house is performative. And here's the part people don't like hearing. If that verification shows the family does not control the property, then the most responsible action is not to rush fundraising, repairs, or relocation plans. It is to slow everything down and put the court between the family and anyone else. Court supervision is not punishment. It is insulation. It prevents quiet transfers. It prevents coercive signatures. It prevents helpers from becoming owners. It prevents exploitation disguised as assistance. This is exactly how vulnerable families lose land without ever realizing it's happening. Someone offers help. Paperwork gets signed. Years later, the house is gone. And everyone says, how did that happen? It happens because urgency replaces verification. Now let's talk honestly about what should happen next. Not what might happen. Not what people hope happens. What protects the family? First, no sale, transfer, trust, power of attorney, or fundraising tied to the property should move forward without court oversight. Period. Second, if state involvement continues with removed family members, asset protection must be explicitly addressed before costs accumulate silently. Third, any outside individual claiming authority or influence over the home should be required to prove it publicly and legally, not emotionally. Fourth, community concern should shift from who's guilty to who is watching the paperwork. Because attention without structure is how this story got here in the first place. And here's the hardest truth of all. Even if Betty and Larry want to leave one day, even if they want a smaller place, even if they want safety elsewhere, that decision still depends on legal control. Without it, choice becomes illusion. That is why this isn't about nostalgia for the house. It's about preventing the house from being taken quietly while everyone argues loudly online. So let's end this the only honest way. Not with certainty. Not with outrage. But with responsibility. If you truly care about the Whittakers, you should want less movement, more verification. Less urgency, more oversight. Less emotion, more protection. And now I'll ask the one question that actually tests whether people are serious about helping or just watching. Answer it plainly. No speeches. No hedging. Should any sale, transfer, or control of the Whittaker property be legally blocked unless it is supervised by the court? Yes or no? And if you answer no, explain, specifically, what safeguard you trust more than judicial oversight. Because in 2026, the most dangerous thing isn't the internet. It's silence paired with paperwork. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.